Well, welcome back to the hot seat. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Catherine Grum, who's a partner and head of family office at BDO in London. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, David. It's good to see you.
Indeed. So, BDO have recently published a new report called World of Private Client. We're going to discuss it a little bit today, but perhaps you just tell us a little bit of background on the report, some of the key findings and what it covers.
Yeah, certainly. So we're really excited to be finally publishing this report. It's something that we've been working on in the background for a few years now. So it was planned pre-pandemic, but actually we were reaching out to the participants, both private clients and their advisors, during the course of 2020. So we're getting some very sort of live and real feedback to the events that were going on. We've got over 350 responses covering 16 different jurisdictions. And we also incorporated 25 interviews to get some more in-depth feedback on the responses that we were getting. And the report looks at quite a few different areas that we think are central to the world of the private client these days. So the first one, relocation, also looking at transparency, family and generational wealth. And then finally, we were also interested in what was expected of the advisor of the future. So that's the final segment of the report.
Excellent. And those who are interested to read in full can do so at a microsite. So we'll provide the details of that around this video, but it's something that you're promoting to intermediary contacts and clients themselves to seek a bit of guidance on the latest trends.
Yeah, absolutely. The content should be relevant to both. So it's the views of both the clients themselves and also the advisors.
Perfect. So, I mean, what are some of the summary of the priorities for high net worth clients over the coming months, particularly looking at how investment growth and risk management in these very volatile and uncertain times?
Yeah, so one, I think, of the really interesting questions that we asked those completing the survey, the research, was what would they be prioritising over the next 12 to 18 months? And actually, we found that a majority of those responding, firstly, said that they would be making at least moderate, if not significant, changes to their wealth planning strategy as a result of the pandemic and everything that's been going on. I think something like only 8% said that they'd be making no changes at all. So the first thing is clients are going to be reviewing their arrangements. And that's obviously very relevant to your whole audience, no matter what sphere of the private client world they come from. In terms of what their priorities were, the top two were quite investment focused. And changes to their investment approach, both from the perspective of making the most of opportunities and looking at how they could seek further growth of their assets and their businesses, but also managing risk and how they responded to everything that happened over the last, well, now 12 months or so. And certainly, if I look at what we're seeing from our clients, I think those priorities are very much reflected in the areas that we're being asked to advise them on. In terms of making the most of the opportunities, we get sent some really interesting investments from clients. They either want tax perspectives, how to structure them, or sometimes we'd get colleagues from our due diligence and corporate finance team involved to actually help them do a bit more of a sort of kicking the tires on potential investments directly. Certainly where they're doing private equity type investments. But in terms of the structuring, we're seeing different vehicles for holding those investments. Had a couple of queries recently, for example, around use of OICs, but also how families and how clients can work together and structure joint investments. Something that I think has been going on quite a lot over the past couple of years. But now they're really trying to professionalize that structuring approach and get it a bit more almost institutionalized for those sorts of families. But on the conversations that I'm having a lot with my family business clients, they're also asking, if they've got a business, I think they've come to realization that they have, the family's wealth, their eggs all in one basket. And some of these families built up their businesses in sectors, over multiple generations. But if you look at how the pandemic has impacted, for example, the hospitality sector, it's been pretty indiscriminate. And so I think whatever sector the families are in, they have seen at first hand, if it's not been their own business, businesses of friends and people that they've worked with really significantly impacted. And so a lot of them are looking at how they might diversify to protect themselves. And that's at one end of the spectrum, they may be looking at sales. And we certainly know some families who think, we've ridden this wave for long enough. But actually, a lot of the others are looking at how they might extract cash from a business in some way so that they can help broaden the family's investments. And there's so many different aspects caught up in that. Certainly the families that I've been speaking to, often it's been something that's been in the back of their minds for a while that's now catalyzed into action. But they don't know where to begin. There's concerns about the reputational repercussions if they are seen to be exiting or extracting money from their business. They don't know where to start from the investment perspective. If they're trying to diversify, how do they actually go about that? So there's a lot of support and education and really trying to help them cut through that and think through where do you want your family to be in the future? What is your ultimate vision? And then let's work back from that. If we've got a clear picture, we can help you look at the steps that you need to take to get you from where you are now to where you want to be, looking at the risks that maybe get in your way or the opportunities that you want to take advantage of.
Okay, I mean, the nature of this crisis, the fact it's health driven, and you mentioned, clients wanting to get their affairs in order, but then also to be more proactive. I suppose those who were in sectors, perhaps in retail, in leisure, in areas where they felt secure, of actually it's exposed risks that they hadn't anticipated. Do you think the fact that it's been a health crisis rather than a financial crisis or crisis similar to which we've experienced in our lifetimes, has that given it a different spin in how people are planning and responding to it?
I think it has, because I think it's caused them to reflect in different ways. So I think a lot of families have had to address their own mortality, and individuals can no longer think that they're going to live forever. It usually takes an event close to home to bring that to life. So if it's something that's happened to you or a relative or close contact, with the pandemic, everybody unfortunately has very sad stories coming out of that. And I think that realization is perhaps what's being the real catalyst in a way that it wasn't during the financial crisis, sort of 2008, 2009.
And I suppose people want to formalise plans such that if the health does deteriorate, something unexpected happens, that their family is not left with a mess of investments or agreements between entities that are not well documented and not sort of tried and tested. So do you think that's also where some of the wealth planning demand is coming from, in the sense of to have a sporadic range of investments that aren't well organised becomes less desirable because people think, well, if I was to pass away, I'd be leaving my beneficiaries with issues to sort out at a time when they don't, when they've got other stresses and pressures in their lives.
Well, certainly, aside from those two investment motivations, the third priority that was coming out of the research very clearly was succession planning. And I think part of that, everyone thinks of succession planning and writing your will and managing the tax. But actually, so much of succession planning is actually the preparation and understanding the assets that you've got and how those will be taken on by your children or whoever else may be inheriting, and trying to make that process as easy as possible. I mean, it's a transfer that happens. The event that causes it might be something that happens overnight, but the actual transfer is something that will happen over a course of years. And really thinking about understanding what you own, what information needs to be passed on, and I think really importantly, what you want to tell those who are receiving the assets about your history, where they came from, and the real sort of emotional attachment, that's what turns something from a mere transfer into a gift. And if you're making that gift, then that is something that the next generation are going to use and receive in a very different way. And I think people are, because of their concerns, and we can come on to talk about this in more detail, but actually they are trying to think through some of the practical issues and get that prepared, as much as just having a will or having the tax advice in place.
As advisors, I guess you can add value to the process by advising the family business on using other examples of where families have made that transition successfully. For them, if they're first generation wealth creators, they might not have been in this situation before. And so by providing them with guidance and looking at examples of how other families have successfully navigated this path, you can really help them, provide a framework for them in their decision making. Is that something that you see as bringing forward value to those who are at this difficult decision juncture?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit on a really, really valid and important point, because as advisors, you often see scenarios, on repeat, and there are some predictable events that happen that you can plan for. But if it's your family and it's happening to you and around you, it can be very difficult to see the wood for the trees. And I always say that the starting point for a family is literally just to help them map out what the world looks like, what the sort of possible outcomes and scenarios are. So if you're using that map analogy, where are the mountains, where are the valleys, where are the rivers, just what are other families doing, and what does that whole landscape look like? And once they can see that, it's much easier for them to say, well, I'm a mountain person, or I'm a beach person, I want to go in that direction. And then you can help them to plot out the route with their eyes open when they've seen and made those conscious choices, rather than what often I think happens to families, and they feel quite panicked and they try making decisions without really actually understanding the full context and perspective of where they are. And actually, the more that you can do that with them as a family, rather than just as the senior generation, also the more effective and impactful the solutions that you're going to create are going to be in the long term.
And I guess it's about that strategic counsel as well, isn't it? I mean, previously you said about corporate finance colleagues helping kick the tires. It's coming to that family business and saying, this business has created wealth for generations, but how well prepared is this business to drive forward? Not only in the people in the family to drive it forward, but is it in the right industry to be prepared to, to help the wealth of the family grow and prosper? And so sometimes I guess it's about looking at every option, and coming in from the outside helps you do that, to really analyze all those options with a cool head, rather than just simply looking at the transfer of the business inevitably down the generations.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's really important, and it came through when we were looking at what's going to be required of the advisor of the future, the ability to understand that big picture, not to advise based on your expertise in a small silo, because you won't then have the other options that are available to that client or that family going through something. So, I specialize in family governance work, but I work with colleagues right across the firm, because family governance can be an important part of a broader process. So if they're thinking through the options for the business, it helps for them to be able to see, well, how might the family relate to the business and make decisions? What are the tax consequences? I bring other colleagues in for that. What are the options from a commercial perspective in terms of what's going on in the market? Where might I get investment, or who might be interested in acquiring a stake in the business? All these different factors have an impact on the actual final decision that a family will make. And if you aren't able to bring those all together for them, it is very difficult for them to make decisions based on just the tax analysis, for example, or just the sort of the finance options that may be open to them.
I mean, do you think that next gens are well equipped in general to deal with these challenges? Is there enough support for them to help kind of come through and make these transitions? Is it possible to characterize what is often a wide group of people with various goals and objectives in lots of different settings. What do you think some of the key kind of characteristics, challenges are for these generations coming through in family business?
Again, a great question, and it is very difficult to characterize because, the phrase next gen can incorporate people in their 60s themselves, and it can incorporate, teenagers and people in their early 20s. And obviously there are going to be, even if you're making sweeping generalizations, there are going to be big differences in those different bands. But it is important to recognize that the attitudes, I think, of those who are coming to inherit wealth in the future are changing. I mean, at the moment, we're at the most significant wealth transfer in history. And the recipients and those who are going to be holding the wealth in the future are a lot less passive, I think it's fair to say, than their previous predecessors were in terms of being part of that process. They've been emboldened, they've got a lot more information available to them through the internet, and they are willing to ask questions. They want to understand what's been done before in terms of the family's planning and why it's been done in that particular way. What are their options now, going back to the point I was making before. And I think there will be differences. So over that timeline in which that succession takes place, in order to help it go through effectively, you need to be able to communicate between the generations within the family, and also do some work to prepare those who are coming into roles, whether it's receiving wealth or whether it's being more involved in a family business, to help prepare them. I mean, we did find there's a changing attitude in the survey, in our results, towards legacy. And a lot of that is driven by the aspects of values and purpose that people are at least more vocal about. I'm not saying that previous generations didn't have values, but I think now it's that people are much more conscious that they have choices that will impact on their values. I think previously families tended to take, and again, there's always exceptions, but families tend to take a bit more of a barbell approach. They had the business, they had the investments that were generating their wealth, and they were put on one side. And then they had their philanthropy or their personal interests, and that's where their values historically were kind of focused. And actually now, what you're finding when you're talking to these families is that you can't distinguish between them, and they have to understand that advisors, firstly, it's important for us as advisors to understand what the family's values and approach is on these different aspects, because it will impact their decisions on the succession structuring, tax, for example. There are quite different attitudes now around the appropriateness and the degree to which people are comfortable with tax planning. Wealth preservation as well is an area that I think historically advisors have just taken as read, that part of a private client advisor's role is to help preserve that wealth for future generations, when actually if you talk to a lot of those who are inheriting now or preparing to inherit, what they see as the biggest crisis and biggest threat to their future existence is, for example, the climate. And therefore it seems to a lot of those alien to be talking about preserving wealth for their grandchildren when there are threats to the climate that will have a much more adverse effect on their grandchildren. Therefore so they've got very different priorities there around that. And even topics like philanthropy, they don't necessarily associate with the word, although actually if you sort of strip back to understand what philanthropy is, you'll find that the idea is something that they, giving back and being more involved in the community is something they want to do, but they tend to do it by actions, not just by writing checks. So when you're helping to do that succession planning or helping to look at the family legacy, actually really understanding and unpicking for that particular family what values are at play and what their attitudes and their approaches are, means that whatever you're going to put in place, whether it's the investment strategy, whether it's structuring, whether it's the tax planning, you'll be building on much firmer foundations rather than setting a train in motion that actually the next generation are going to want to get off.
Interesting. And are you finding that this sentiment is being captured in family charter documents? It's being formally documented, people are buying into the sentiments that the family agrees on. I mean, it's widely talked about within the industry, but what do you see in terms of the number of families formally creating and implementing these charter documents?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly talking to a lot of families who I think traditionally people would have felt the wealth levels were perhaps below those where you go for a family charter, but actually a lot of the work that we're doing with them is just to help unpick and understand the values and the principles that they want to apply. So, working with a family where, parents in their 50s and young children in their 20s, they're not sort of hundreds of family members. They want to have, as I said earlier, there are succession events that are predictable, and they want to think through those in advance and think about how they as a family feel about them, what their values are. And it's much easier to do that in advance. Issues like prenups, for example, if you're having a conversation with a family and none of the next generation are yet engaged or married, you're having a conversation in the abstract. It's not personal in the same way that if you're having a conversation with a young couple who are about to get married and you're talking about prenups, it becomes very much more personal. I mean, that's just one example of some of the things that you can look at covering in a sort of family charter document based on principles. So it basically helps set the scenes of what the family can expect. And I think that's a really important point, because a lot of conflict arises because people haven't had their expectations managed. And going through this process, you're being clear about what that family can expect, also what they cannot expect. So what are the limits? So are they going to have to work for a living because they're not going to have to be completely financially supported, or are they going to have a significant inheritance, albeit a few years in the future? And actually sharing that information up front can help people plan and be a lot more stable. And also it sets out what's expected of them to be a part of the family and to be participating in this. And I think the way you asked your question about drafting family charters and what goes into them, it picks up on another important point, which is there's a lot more people talking about family charters, family constitutions, which I think is really, really good and healthy, because I think they are a really important tool for families. But a lot of the value comes through the process a family goes through in order to get to the point at which you can start drafting a document. So facilitating conversations across those generations and cross-checking those against individuals at each different generation, what their own personal hopes and ambitions are before you go into creating a document. And what sometimes happens is the document is dictated by a principal of a family as their kind of legacy and views for the future, and then it's kind of codified and written down as the family charter, and it's really not. It's that individual's aspirations or expectations, and that can be helpful. Again, if you understand what it may give colour to that gift, to that inheritance, and the background to it, and the expectations. But it's not. I would say it's not as useful for that family going forwards as something that they've co-created together, because then it's much more likely to be something that inspires them and makes them want to be part of that family enterprise, whatever it may be going forwards.
Absolutely. I think it has to inspire, doesn't it, in order for it to have the right effect. But that's hugely interesting. And we're just now 12 months through the first lockdown in the UK. It's really the COVID situation has completely changed the way that professional services in general are delivered. Advisors have had to completely adapt. Banks, law firms, trust companies around the world have had to completely adapt the way that they deliver their service to clients, which was traditionally obviously always done face to face. I mean, what do you think the impact will be, the long-term impact will be of the way professionals have had to adapt to this environment? And what do you think from your report that clients are saying that they're looking for in their advisors, and how advisors can add value to the relationships they have with their clients?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously been so much that's been going on over the past year, and your audience will be living and breathing that. So I don't want to kind of rehash it too much, but I think a few of the things in particular, the real catalyst it's been for technology is something that we recognise in the report, and that clients and advisors are both getting to grips with that. I mean, we now have a digital sort of questionnaire that you can fill in to get your tax return. And that you can use that technology. And I think certainly the next generation in particular will have a greater expectation that technology is used where it can be, to save time and to streamline and make things more efficient. They're used to having information at their fingertips, and they expect that of their advisors, I think, as well. But there's a real double edge to the use of technology where wealthy families are concerned. And you also have to bear in mind, obviously, all the important security implications where families are becoming more digital. They're more digitally connected. They've got social media presences and everything else like that, all sort of neatly packaged up. And I think, that's just one example of where the advisor of the future needs to have, they may not be a specialist in technology. They certainly may not be a specialist in, say, cybersecurity, but they need to know, we've got colleagues that I would call if I wanted to talk to a family about their sort of cybersecurity approach, for example. And I think having that network is something, again, that the report highlights as being really critical for the advisor of the future, because you can't work in that silo. You need to have other advisors that you can bring in and to work as a team. And I also think that makes the role more enjoyable, where you're collaborating with others and together you're working to help and support that client. Because, another thing that the pandemic has showed us, but I think people were aware of already, is that life is just getting more and more complex. And it's funny, the sort of path in which advisors have taken, if you speak to the real sort of doyens of the private client industry now, they would say that they were really broad advisors to their clients, and their clients would come to talk to them about a lot. But in the intervening years, people have become a lot more specialist, and it's a bit like an hourglass. So there's been more technical issues, if you're a tax advisor, the yellow books have stacked up, and the same in all, the investment world, the different types of investment. So people have become more and more specialist, and more expectation that to give advice, you have to have this degree of expertise and specialism. But actually, clients need advisors to broaden out again, and not necessarily give advice in areas where they're not experts, but to understand that broader context and to work with others to get the whole piece of that advice in place. And I think that's something, again, that our report drew out. And if you look at succession planning as one example, it's an area that I already said came through in the research as a priority of clients, but also I think many advisors recognize it's something that clients don't actually get on and do. They say it's important, but then it never actually gets done. And if you start trying to unpick, because one of the things we did in the report, why that might be, and you hear the responses that come back from the client, the top two were reluctance to relinquish control and a lack of time. Now, taking the lack of time point first, if it is a priority, you make time for it. So either it's not a genuine priority, or there's actually something else going on. It's not necessarily a lack of time. It's a lack of managing and putting that time aside to deal with it. And I think that's because of some of the other reasons why people are reluctant to succession plan. So the relinquishing of control, if it's something that you're a bit concerned about, then it kind of drifts down your to-do list. And the advisors need to understand, if you're going to advise someone on their succession plan, actually what some of these potential barriers might be. And the reluctance to relinquish control, I think there's lots of things that could be behind that, but two very common aspects are, one, the impact that wealth might have on the next generation, and very real concerns that actually the wealth that is supposed to be a positive force for their family could actually have an adverse negative impact. Wealth is a great amplifier, and it can amplify good, but it can also amplify ill. And the concerns about generations becoming entitled, losing their purpose and drive, and what might flow on from that is a very real one. But actually, if you are concerned about that as a client, then failing to plan, you're only making that worse. And actually what you should be doing is trying to grasp the nettle, but looking at how you might start to prepare your heirs and those who are going to inherit, whether it's helping them with financial literacy or putting a broader plan in place if there are a lot of complex aspects of the inheritance, in order to give them the best chance at it, rather than just put it off and hope that somehow it'll magically get fixed. You know, and another issue I think that underpins that is actually concerns about, you know, the people who have created the wealth over the generations. That gets tied up in their identity, and when they're having to pass it on, suddenly it's questioning, well, what's their purpose going to be moving forwards? And again, the advisors need to be aware of these sorts of dynamics, and you can take some of the sting out of it by changing the language you use. So rather than succession planning, you can talk about continuity planning, particularly if it's a family business or other enterprise, or you can talk about planning for their legacy and turn it into a positive. And you can also think about other roles that they may have, perhaps in the family's philanthropic activities, or as a wise sort of family counsel and elder, and help to reinforce those points. So that kind of what's required of you as an advisor, because of these complexities that are affecting clients. You really kind of, there's a lot out there that you need to get your head round to be a good advisor. But I think that's also what for many people attracts them to the world of private clients.
Terrific. Well, thank you for talking to me today. We'll share the link for where people can download the full report on this BDO publication, and we look forward to sharing this with our members. So thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, David. It's good to speak to you.